Here in this video, we're going to finish up, the last portion of chapter 21 on population genetics, and this is about the mechanisms of evolution. So with Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, the mechanisms of evolution, probably one of the most important things we can get from this whole unit. So if thinking back what we've done so far, chapter 21 is probably the most important as far as information that might be on the exam. So far, chapters 21 and 22 will be like that. So, what do we mean about mechanisms of evolution? Well, what specific things can cause evolution to happen? We talked about natural selection already, but that's not the only thing. So, after we've studied Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, we now know that there are 5 conditions that underlie Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. That means there are 5 things that are criteria we have to meet to ensure that no evolution will occur. If any one of these factors is not met, evolution will occur. And I have the 5 factors down here. And there are 3 mechanisms: natural selection, genetic drift, and gene flow, which violate these one or more of these Hardy-Weinberg conditions in a way that directly change allelic frequencies. First, natural selection. When individuals in a population have traits that are inheritable, that better suit their survival in an environment. And that breaks this Hardy-Weinberg criteria for natural selection right there. Genetic drift. Genetic drift is when chance events that aren't related to natural selection happen, which cause allelic frequencies to change from generation to generation. And some of those examples that meet genetic drift are large populations. So genetic drift happens a lot in very small populations. And mutation is another example of things that genetic drift violates. And gene flow is the movement of alleles into and out of a population by emigration or immigration. And gene flow breaks the criteria of no emigration or immigration right there. I didn't mention random mating for sexual selection because sexual selection really doesn't change the allele frequency in a different population. It just changes the genotypes, which you can think goes back to violating a rule we've already talked about natural selection, and no one genotype is better suited than the other. So first I'll talk about genetic drift. So sometimes just random chance events that aren't related to natural selection or the fitness of an organism can happen that can influence which alleles are passed on. And this is called genetic drift. One example of that is, since we're assuming mating is random, it's possible that one allele will be present in the next generation at a higher frequency than other alleles just due to chance alone, due to let's say this individual mating with this individual and having a late brown butterfly, and this individual mating with this other light brown individual and having another light brown butterfly. Or in this picture, when only these 5 flowers have offspring, and then the next generation is a lot more highly saturated with red flowers than the previous flower, just because they ended up mating together. And then what if only these 2 plants from the second generation leave offspring? Well, you can see how the allele frequency of dominant R versus recessive R has changed over time just by random mating chance. also maybe perhaps just chance survival that's not to do with anything heritable about an organism increases the allelic frequency in the next generation. So what about these bugs? If someone happens to step on 2 green ones, after that event, the population has changed significantly. The allelic frequencies have changed just due to chance. That is an example of genetic drift. And lastly, just chance segregation of alleles in heterozygous individuals. So, for example, if I have 2 alleles, we'll go back to the R's, R and R. If a heterozygous individual ends up mating with, say, a homozygous individual, the allelic frequency in the next generation can be altered, because what happens if, by and large, more heterozygous individuals donate the dominant allele versus the recessive? Every time it's 50-50, but what if just because of chance, more dominant alleles survive to the next generation than the recessive ones in heterozygous matings? That will cause a change in allele frequency, but only due to random chance, to genetic drift. There are 2 specific examples of genetic drift I want to make sure you know, because they could be asked of you on the AP test, and they're called the founder effect and bottlenecking. The founder effect happens when a population emigrates, so leaves and finds a new home. When a few individuals become isolated from the regular population, so here's a regular population of butterflies with specific phenotypic traits for color. When they emigrate to colonize a new area, this smaller population might not adequately reflect, or might not closely reflect, the allelic frequencies of the source population. And so when this population proliferates and mates and generations continue on, there will be a different allelic frequency in this population on this island than in this island here at the source island. That's called the founder effect, when the small amounts of founders of this new population don't adequately reflect the diversity of alleles from the source population. The second kind of specific example of genetic drift is called the bottleneck effect. So this is when a crisis happens, a disaster, or some event that greatly reduces the population size happens. And just by chance, not because of fitness or adaptation, the survivors express a phenotypic ratio that isn't reflective of the parental population. So the allelic frequency in the survivors does not reflect the allelic frequencies of the source population. And over time, this can create or lead to evolution, a change in allelic frequencies. So, founders effect, bottlenecking, 2 important examples of genetic drift. Then there's gene flow. So when allele frequency changes because immigration or emigration is happening. So, for example, we have 2 populations of beetles, same species, and one brown beetle leaves this population and enters the green one. The allelic frequency of maybe the alleles for the trait of color is now changed because of the immigration of this virile, mature, able to reproduce beetle from this other population. Right? And the important thing is that this can change how well a population adapts to their environment. For example, here is how gene flow has worked on a local population in the North Sea. So, populations in which the surviving females eventually breed. The central population and the eastern population are different populations of Paris major birds in the Netherlands, this island in the Netherlands. And they were found in 2 distinctly different areas, the eastern and the central areas of this island, hence their name. But you can see that the females born in the central population, right here, survive greater when they are living in the central population. And the females that are born in the eastern population have a higher survival rate when they eventually breed. And so when these members of one species move over to the next, they can affect the survival rate of that species by then breeding with those birds there. So gene flow can affect how well a population evolves to be able to adapt to their surroundings, given this example of differential survival of the Paris Major in the Netherlands in the North Sea. The third thing, we kind of talked about this already, but natural selection is also the third mechanism by which evolution can happen. And it's the only mechanism that always or consistently increases allele frequencies that confer reproductive advantage. And this is what's called adaptive selection. So natural selection is the only one of these three mechanisms that increase the allelic frequencies of alleles that confer advantages. Gene flow and genetic drift don't necessarily increase allelic frequencies of advantageous genes. Natural selection depends a lot on what's called relative fitness. So relative fitness is basically how advantageous or better at survival and reproduction is a given genotype versus all other genotypes in that population. It's usually expressed in a number 0 to 1. So of all the genotypes for a given trait, we would assign the number 1 to the most fit and 0 to the least fit of all of those genotypes. Relative fitness is important when there is a competition for food, water, mate, shelter, for resources, because the genotypes that confer the greatest fitness will then better survive by better competing for those resources. It's important to know that natural selection favors the most fit individual, or the individuals that have a genotype that confer the greatest fitness. And what is mean by fitness is not the biggest or strongest or fastest, but the genotype that allows an organism to survive and reproduce to the greatest extent. So, fitness is not necessarily the genotypes that allow an organism to live the longest, or be the fastest or biggest or best able to get food. That might be the case, but at its base, natural selection favors those genotypes that allow an organism to survive, produce the most amount of offspring that are then able to survive to adulthood and reproduce themselves. So, an organism is more fit if it is able to have 5 offspring that grow to reproduce themselves versus having 2 offspring to grow and reproduce themselves. Maybe one organism lives for 100 years but only produces 2 offspring that go and live to reproduce. That organism will be less likely to be favored by natural selection than an organism that lives for 2 years and produces 10 viable offspring that live to reproduce themselves. Right? That's why bacteria are still around. That's why flies are still around. Even though they have short lifespan, they produce many offspring that can then survive and reproduce into adulthood. So natural selection also has to do with a heavy amount with how many survivable offspring can you reproduce or can you create. In general, sorry about this. In general, we're going to talk about kind of the 3 forms of natural selection here. I just messed up here with one of my pictures. But there are 3 patterns in natural selection. So it can occur differently depending on which phenotypic traits are selected for. And there's directional, disruptive, and stabilizing selection. One example, directional selection, is when a specific environmental conditions are favoring individuals at one extreme of a phenotypic range. So, for example, in the Grant's research with the medium ground finches, the conditions favored birds with larger beak sizes. The larger beak sizes, the easier it was to crush those big seeds, the better they survived. That would be directional selection. Over time, you would see the frequency of birds with larger beaks increase. That's very different than disruptive selection, when same environmental conditions favor individuals with both extremes of a trait. This might be if in that same situation, finches with very, very large or very, very small beaks were able to survive, but not medium-sized beaks. And then lastly, stabilizing selection is when conditions favor the intermediate phenotype. So the phenotype that's the medium beak size. And one example I want to give to you is the pocket mouse, and we are going to look at that here in class. But the pocket mice live in the desert, Arizona, that is covered by old lava flows that have dried up. And this dried basaltic rock is dark black. Dark black. All right? And these rock pocket mice can be any of these different colors, white to darker gray to black. All right? Their main predator is hawks that uses their eyesight to spot them out. All right? Mice that live on the lava flow that's dark black are much more darkly colored than mice that live on the very gray surrounding desert. Directional selection has happened in the past for mice that live on that dark rock. Original mice were a little bit lighter brown right here. And over time, the increased fitness and survivability of darker mice, see they didn't get spotted by the hawk and eaten as much, caused the dark color to persist in the population and directional selection to occur because darker skin color or hair color was favored. So the population distribution of fur color moved over, were skewed, was directed to the right, to the darker side. All right? But that's kind of not the whole story, all right? On the lighter color, not the lava flow, the regular dusty brown desert sand, lighter colored mice survived better. So on that side, the lighter colored phenotypes were favored and selection was acting the opposite way. So as a whole, looking at the whole population on the lava flow and off the lava flow, disruptive selection occurred. The dark phenotype was favored in those portions of the environment on the lava flow that had a darker background, and lighter phenotypes were favored on the desert floor. But in between was easy to spot on the lava flow or off, not favored in either environmental condition, and so diminished. That would be an example of disruptive selection. If for some reason the medium or the brown colored mouse survived the best on either, then we would see stabilizing selection that favored the medium phenotype. In general, stabilizing selection reduces genetic diversity, directional selection reduces genetic diversity, and disruptive selection increases it away from the median. Sexual selection was something that was really interesting that Darwin found interesting. That was kind of a special case of natural selection. So sexual selection is when individuals with a certain sexual characteristic have a greater chance of procuring a mate. So it's not natural selection. Has nothing to do with being more fit to survive, but more able to procure a mate and then reproduce. Doesn't have to do with adaptations towards your environment. And sexual selection has resulted in what's called sexual dimorphisms, or when there's a difference in the aesthetic sexual secondary characteristics between males and females. So why peacocks, males have the big bright feathers and the females have the drab feathers, or why some sexes, one is a lot bigger than the other, or a lot more well ornamented than the other. Sexual selection has caused this. And there's two ways that sexual selection kind of operates. Intersexual selection, where there's a competition between two individuals of the same sex for a mate. Classic example, elk and deer and rams males fighting each other with their horns over a female. So they're competing with each other, these horn sexual characteristics for a mate. Or intersexual selection, so individuals of one sex are being choosy and choosing or selecting the mate of the other sex. Like the female peacocks look for the best feather display of the males and choose mates based on that. What's important to know is sexual selection can sometimes operate at the detriment of adaptive selection. So because of this female preference for large showy feathers in male peacocks will start to evolve, or may start to evolve, bigger and more elaborate feathers. Those bigger and more elaborate feathers can make them easier to spot by predators and work in opposite of adaptive selection. So, just because things is sexually selected doesn't mean it confers an advantageous adaptation to surviving in that environment. So last thing I'm going to kind of end with is you might say, what prevents all favorable alleles from becoming fixed? So from all bad alleles from completely leaving the population and just having good or positive alleles left. Well, the main idea is that in diploid organisms, recessive alleles are hidden. For example, recessive alleles aren't expressed and can't really be selected for in heterozygote individuals, and so are preserved, even if they're harmful. All right? And two examples of this type are balancing selection. So when natural selection maintains two or more different forms in a population. Two and more different forms. And they're in the categories of heterozygous advantage and frequency-dependent selection. So when natural selection maintains two or more different forms in a population, that's preserving genetic variation. Heterozygosity preserves genetic variation and happens via heterozygous advantage and frequency-dependent selection. Heterozygous advantage is when the heterozygous genotype is more fit than either homozygous genotypes. An example is in sickle cell disease. Sickle cell disease is a recessive disorder, and those who are homozygous recessive suffer severe fatal sickle cell attacks. But the sickle cell shape prevents an infection from a malarial-inducing parasite. Those without the recessive allele are susceptible to malaria, but don't have the adverse effects and can't die of sickle cell disease. However, the heterozygous phenotype is resistant to malaria, much like the homozygous recessive sickle cell disease patient, but they may not have the sickle cell crisis, or it might not be as bad. So in Africa, where areas of high incidence of malaria are present, this heterozygous phenotype offers a significant advantage and allows for the preservation of this harmful allele in the population. Second example is frequency-dependent selection. And that's when the fitness of a phenotype is dependent on how common that phenotype is in the population. An example I'm going to use is left-handedness. So, people who are left-handed in class, this is you. So, left-handedness is a balancing selection. So we're maintaining right and left-handedness in the population. And the reason left-handedness is still in the population, even though most people are right-handed, is through frequency-dependent selection. Being left-handed is only beneficial when most other people are right-handed. And one of the reasons they're thinking that left-handedness persevered in the population wasn't gotten wiped out by the dominance of right-handedness is because left-handed people were better able to survive in hand-to-hand combat. So think of when you are a swordsman, maybe in the medieval times, or in the earlier Stone Age and Bronze Age periods, and you're fighting another person. You are most likely to come across another right-handed person and fight with them like they are right-handed. Expect attacks to come from the right side. Then when you are faced with a left-handed person that you are fighting, the rare circumstance, you aren't used to fighting against them, that their attacks are coming from the same side your sword arm is coming from. And so they have an upper hand, they have an advantage. And the differential survival in hand-to-hand combat of left-handed individuals has caused that trait to persevere over time. If too many people are left-handed, it's not very advantageous. Now more right-handed people are likely to have met a left-handed person before, faced them in combat, and know how to compete with them. Then it's not advantageous. So left-handedness is only advantageous when it's in the minority of the population. And that's an example of frequency-dependent selection. Right, so why perfectly fit organisms don't exist? Well, selection can only act on existing variation. That's why birds can never have jet engines. The variation, the genetic precedents have to be there. Also, we can't start from scratch every time. There's evolutionary limitations that allow for organisms to develop correctly and survive that can't be changed. Adaptations are often compromises between environmental stressors and other things. So we can't have perfect super lungs because our lungs do very many other things besides just hold our breath. Then fourth, chance, environment, and natural selection all interact, and sometimes these interactions are counterproductive. I mean, they don't always allow the best fit trait to come to the top. All right, this is it for today. Let me know if you have any questions, and see you on Friday.